As mentioned in our other mid-year review lists, 2020 has seen a huge amount of great games released across its first half. Of course, while that's good for players, it's made writing these midterm reports a right faff on. There have just been too many good games, and there aren't many that have been outright stinkers. That said though, there have been too many for my liking still that haven't quite lived up to initial expectations. Now, just because something ended up being disappointing doesn't mean it's terrible and a complete write-off. In fact, some of the games on this list are still a lot of fun and worthy of your time, it's just that fans expected more from them. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are the 9 most disappointing video games of the year so far. Number 9, Maneater. At the heart of it, video game fans, myself included, are simple folk. Give us a fun concept with some satisfying mechanics and we can have a whale, or in this case I guess a slightly different underwater creature, of a time. As a result, a game where you control a man-eating shark and terrorize a bunch of tasty humans with your massive mouth should have been an easy win. An open goal, a home run. Maneater wasn't supposed to just be brainless destruction either though. The team were open about how they were taking inspiration from the likes of Dark Souls and Far Cry, and wanted to make a genuinely original sandbox game. Consequently, expectations were surprisingly high for the quirky title, but the promise of the concept didn't quite come together in the final release. It might have been too ambitious in fact, and the concept kind of crumbles under the awkward controls and repetitive shark combat. There's still fun to be had, but there's too much busy work, not enough finesse, and it's far too frustrating to have fun for an extended period of time. Number 8, Little Town Hero. Game Freak is a studio primarily known for its hugely popular Pokemon games, but over the past few years it's been attempting to forge out a new identity, one that isn't so inherently tied to Nintendo's fan-favourite RPG series. Little Town Hero, a colourful turn-based RPG that was originally released on the Nintendo Switch last year, came to Xbox One and PS4 earlier in 2020 and didn't exactly set the world on fire. It enjoyed decent enough reviews with critics praising the cute art style and fascinating though convoluted combat system. It has a lot of personality going for it as well, helped massively by Toby Fox's music, but there's not a whole lot going on underneath the hood. To many, Little Town Hero was a distraction that could have been dropped in favour of a much better mainline Pokemon game had the devs just averted their attention to that full time. To others, this was supposed to be an RPG that could go toe-to-toe with the studio's biggest series, but turned out not quite being the contender they hoped it would be. Number 7, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 Remastered. Ever since the original Modern Warfare received a remaster, fans have been clamouring for the second, and arguably most famous, entry in the subseries to get the same makeover. Not only is it a beloved game with its 10-year anniversary recently provoking a huge wave of nostalgia, but the work done to the original Modern Warfare was actually kinda stunning. Yes, holding it to ransom behind Infinite Warfare and selling its DLC as extra was borderline criminal, but the actual touch-up it received across the single-player and multiplayer suites was among the best as far as remasters go. Admittedly, the devs also did a great job with Modern Warfare 2 as well. It's just that the portion of the game that was remastered wasn't actually the one fans were looking forward to revisiting. That's because, unlike its predecessor, it was only the single-player campaign that was being sold here. While it was well updated, fans were undeniably left deflated that the multiplayer suite wasn't included in the package as well. Activision very much didn't want to cannibalize their other Modern Warfare game by including this section, but at the end of the day, who is itching to drop $30 to replay an old COD campaign? Number 6. Predator Hunting Grounds. Predator Hunting Grounds is perhaps the most frustrating game on this list, because when it's working as intended, it is one hell of a fun time. Either playing as the best hunter in the galaxy or a muscle-bound soldier, this asymmetrical experience can result in some all-time great multiplayer moments, but those highs only make the lows that much more disappointing. Made by the same team who worked on Friday the 13th the game, this latest project doesn't quite live up to the premise in that same way. With a lack of mission variety, some wonky controls, and difficulty actually getting to play as the Predator, which is admittedly a problem that plagues a lot of these asymmetrical multiplayer games, there's a lot of downtime between the thrills. Still, the beauty of this subgenre is that often what you get at launch isn't exactly how the game eventually shapes up, and Hunting Grounds could be transformed into something as compelling as its spiritual predecessor. And like I said, there is still a lot of fun to be had here on its own terms, it's just not quite the big next step a lot of people were hoping for. Number 5. The Outer Worlds Switch version. The Outer Worlds was one of the best games of last year. Obsidian's sci-fi RPG picked up in spirit where Fallout New Vegas left off, giving the world the kind of classic first-person role-playing experience the industry in general has moved away from over the past decade. Full of personality and interesting characters to get to know, it was awesome and a real comeback for the developers, at least in the AAA space. Consequently, Switch fans were looking to get their hands on the game with a port this year, and while the title did arrive a few months after its original launch, it didn't quite survive the transition. The biggest issue came in the graphical department, with pretty much everything having to be scaled down to fit on the underpowered console. This was kind of expected to an extent, but nobody anticipated just how extreme the end result would be. From blurry textures to ugly models, at times it felt like the port was outright unfinished. The Outer Worlds was absolutely one of the best games of the last year, like I said, but the Switch version was also undoubtedly the worst way to play it. Number 4. Iron Man VR. The opening hours of Iron Man VR were genuinely some of the most fun I've had gaming in years. When you first step into Tony Stark's iconic armor and learn how to fly around the outskirts of the character's Malibu home, it fulfills a childhood dream that so many of us have had while we were growing up. It only gets better from there as well, with an electrifying aeroplane set piece that sees you blown out of the aircraft and suiting up to save a still on board Pepper Potts. Sadly though, the rest of the experience rarely reaches those same heights again. This is a VR game that's absolutely worth picking up if you're a fan of the superhero, but you'll undoubtedly spend a good chunk of the runtime wishing it was a bit more than what it is. The game is great in isolated moments, but as a continuous experience, it suffers from a huge amount of fragmentation and stops and starts and stops and starts and loading times and fades to black and stops and starts and more stops and starts. These frequent loading screens and constant fade to blacks, a lack of enemy variety and repetitive missions mark an otherwise solid superhero adventure. There is a great game in there, but sadly you'll probably leave more excited for Iron Man VR 2 than what you've just played. Number 3. Mafia 2 Definitive Edition. Mafia 2 Definitive Edition is going to go down as one of the biggest travesties of the year, partly because this shouldn't have been something publisher 2K could ever mess up. To botch a remaster like this, you almost have to be trying to do a bad job. All that's required for a solid product is a slight bump in quality, the DLC packaged in, and some boost to the performance. Sadly, 2K did this bare minimum and then still managed to piss it all up the wall anyway. Its surprise release was intended to look like a confident mic drop, but the lack of promotion was clearly because the developers and publishers knew exactly the garbage fire that they were putting out. With a frame rate that tanked as soon as you started moving, graphical issues that haunted every single frame, and some trophies that just outright broke, almost every part of this so-called definitive edition, head to toe, was a complete disaster. Even worse, calling it a remaster at all was generous. Some graphical options from the original game were actually taken away, leaving everyone wondering how the devs fell on their faces so badly. Number 2. Resident Evil 3 Remake. Look, I know, I really don't want to be doing this. I absolutely love what Capcom has done with the Resident Evil franchise recently. Pivoting 7 into a completely different direction was a bold and welcome move, while the remake of 2 showed everyone that a third-person survival horror game done in the modern Resi style could still be terrifying without having to be action-packed. As a result, all eyes, included my own, were on 3 to continue this trend, especially because that's arguably one of the earliest mainline entries with the most to build upon with a remake. The original's Raccoon City streets could have become larger, Nemesis more threatening, and the story itself could have been expanded upon to directly intersect with the second game. Sadly, instead of building on what was already there, Resident Evil 3 Remake almost feels like DLC for the previous game. So many assets are reused, so many mechanics are watered down, and the halved runtime doesn't make the game appear like a true sequel. Nemesis himself is the biggest disappointment for me though. The game's short runtime makes his development feel rushed and honestly, in part, a little bit gimmicky. He has a great intro, I'll give him that, but he doesn't quite make the same lasting impression that Mr. X did. Number 1. WARCRAFT 3 Reforged. If there was ever a game that shows the industry has no idea what it's doing, it's WARCRAFT 3 Reforged. On paper, this should have been an easy win for both Blizzard and fans of the franchise. It's a beloved game remade for a modern audience, revitalised and repackaged in a way that would sell like hotcakes even with only minor upgrades. Of course, the developers just couldn't resist from overhauling and modernising major parts of the experience, even though few in the community responded receptively to these alterations. This was all on top of failing to follow through on the initial spectacular look of the game as well, with a lot of graphical features being absent in the final release. The biggest killer though was that the new features retroactively changed the original version of the game as well. If you return to that, the new update would actually add in reforged editions by merging the clients, essentially replacing the original experience everyone loved in the first place. If you wanted to avoid Reforged and didn't buy it, you'd still have to suffer from its existence. The whole thing pretty much became an example of how to take something people love and then warp it beyond recognition. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Are there any games you would have liked to have seen on this list? And are there any here that you actually disagree with? Like I said, a lot of them are just disappointing and not necessarily outright bad. Either way though, while you're down there in the comments, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.